Wait, so tell me about going to the Soviet Union in the 80s. I mean,
Hmm.
do you remember arriving there
Yeah.
and your initial impressions? I mean, what, God, that must have been
Yeah, it
incredible.
was. Well, I think I came home with so many questions because this was the first place, despite having, uh, compared to a lot of people, a pretty mobile and international childhood. Because my father had different postings in different countries, and we moved as a family, and we traveled in between. Um, I had spent most of my life in Europe, and one way or the other, there was some sort of touchstone to the world that I knew as an American kid, and this was my first exposure to a society that, outwardly anyway, seemed to be structured on an entirely different model. I remember arriving in the Soviet Union. There's no advertising. They're just giant political posters. There are stores called milk or stores called meat. There are only a few cars. Most everybody seems to be wearing the same thing. I mean, not a great variety in style or dress, at least to my, at that time, very uninformed observations. And there seemed to be a very stark contrast that I came in time to really thrive on between a kind of closed and dour public presentation or social affect to this incredibly warm, diverse,
Mm.
lively interior world, or the private world of families in their apartments and their dachas and all the rest.
Hmm.
And I was intrigued by that as a young person. It felt like I was unlocking kind of mystery. I had or was learning enough of the language to begin deciphering some of this outward coding. Uh, and then because I was able to live there a little bit longer and benefited from people who'd been there before saying, "Oh, call this person, try and find this person." I I benefited also from a great enthusiasm, interest in the U.S. because the U.S. was a very exotic place for Soviets, most of whom never traveled there, and only knew it dimly through its representation in official media, which was overwhelmingly politically slanted to tell the worst possible stories about the United States.
And people were well aware of that, certainly, right?
Yes, yes,
Right.
and they had their own criticism, but they filled it with a kind of romantic representation of the U.S. that was also wildly off the mark.
Right. Sure, of
And
course.
I was coming with my own preconceptions based on a lot of the media presentation that was a part of our world at the time, which obviously differed in as much as I think there's no question the United States media terrain was more open than that of the Soviet Union in the early 1980s. But the U.S. was still profoundly shaped by a largely myopic and quite channeled Cold War vision of the USSR and the Soviets more generally, full of all kinds of gross simplifications. So I was sort of, as a young person, trying to figure these things out. And I had just enough language to begin to make my own discoveries. And of course, I had just enough time to kind of get past the first sort of outward presentation to look a little bit of what was behind that window front, and that was amazing. That was just so exciting to meet people in their homes, to try to understand what they were telling me, to enjoy their excitement about me. I now can recall some of the vanities maybe of being a younger person, realizing, wow, they really think I'm interesting. People ask me, so what's Reagan like? Well, I have to say I don't know, but thanks, thanks for these guys. It was one
Yeah,
of these intense
sure.
little moments,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
but
yeah.
I realized that was something that I recognized over time was special about that moment, the moment that I lived in as an exchange student. And many of the students that I met later, or people who became my colleagues in the field, but who were kind of entered the field a little bit later, when some of this romance had peeled away, and
Yeah.
the relationship was at once more open and less interesting,
Mm.
and maybe uglier in some regards. I mean, the Soviet Union was not a pretty place. There were a lot of things terribly, terribly wrong with the Soviet system, and there was a lot that was terribly, terribly wrong about the U.S.-Soviet relationship. But it provided this structure, and within the structure, there was room for an awful lot of what I would call kind of public diplomacy between individual citizens, Soviets and Americans. And there was a lot of goodwill in those exchanges, in part because they were imagined as being a kind of foil. Well, sometimes a foil, but certainly as this other track of connection between the two states, separate from the fact that they were staring at each other through, these vast nuclear arsenals. And that informed the intensity of the relationships that I was stepping into, even as a college undergraduate. And I realized how formative that was for me. That I had my own sort of romantic moment, I guess I'd say, and through a lifetime of studying the country and the culture and all the countries and cultures that intersect with it, I obviously now feel like I have a more informed view. But I'm still grateful for this sort of naive introduction. Really, it was meaningful to me. It gave me its own necessary shaping.
You reminded me of in the 50s, the U.S. tried to put these propaganda movies into theaters in Mexico and other parts of Latin America. It had them made in Mexico, where there was already it was kind of the biggest film industry in Latin America. There was already a lot of experience with creating propaganda. Little news, newsreels by the PRI. And but the hilarious thing is when they would show these things in the 50s in the theaters, the crowds would always recognize them like instantaneously because they were so used to the bullshit that they were already seeing. And so I was just thinking of how, the people become quite sophisticated, right, to this sort of thing. And then if you can actually talk to another just ordinary human, it's like,
it's incredibly fulfilling, exciting. Well, right. Many of my Soviet interlocutors, as I recall them from the time, they were excited to ask me the questions that they couldn't possibly ask, an official Soviet representative, some guy from the party or some fellow from their, I don't know, university if they were students. But they also enjoyed kind of letting me in on their secrets, because we were all participating in a certain charade. Out there we wear our brown coats and we keep our heads down and we stand in line and we wait for our sour cream. Inside here, we show our full colors. We talk warmly. We embrace. We stick a finger at the party, and frankly, we curse the Americans too if we have to. But not in that staid, politically correct or propaganda correct way, but with real human passion.
Way.
Yes,
Totally. Yes. Where did you stay?
Well, when I was a student, I lived in a dorm for foreign students attached to this institute for the instruction of Russian to foreign students. It was all quite how would I put it, structured to keep foreigners somewhat apart.
Right.
By the same token, the controls at that point were already breaking down. I was even then experiencing a very different introduction to the Soviet Union than any of my teachers, a generation or half generation removed from me. And then as my training and then career as an academic progressed, I entered a world that my forefathers and foremothers as teachers had never, ever seen, access to all kinds of material, the possibility of traveling far and wide across the country in all the spaces of the former USSR, or most of them anyway. That also, going back to your question about how and whether or to what extent my experience of being there really motivated me, I realize now, recalling some of these experiences, just the fact that it was sort of coming open in my time, like in this time now, you can go to the Volga, you can travel to the far off Siberia, you can go to Vladivostok, you can go to all these cities that were once closed. There was some sort of extra excitement for the unpacking of a place that had been so sealed up in different ways. And I think that too fueled my excitement for this experience of being over there.
Absolutely.